New tab. Nice. Oh, look at that. Look at these very old self-portraits of mine. Is this me streaming? New tab. Nice. Wow, cool. All right, that's too insane to be a part of. All right. So cool. So now that I've seen myself on camera, I realize how silly I look when I pull faces, so I shall refrain from doing that. I'm gonna start the lecture in 2 minutes. There's still probably people trickling in. In the meantime, maybe chuck in the chat what you think interactivity is. What does interactivity mean? What is interaction? What kinds of things might count as interactive art? Chuck it in the chat. Thanks, Janice. Glad you're excited. I assume that like means that you're excited. Such a good way to finish off the week. A little bit of art theory, get us to think about the world in a different way. Ready for the weekend. Okay, I'm going to start recording now, and hopefully everyone is able to see and hear me okay. I'm going to kick off into our topic for today, which is interactive art, because we here in it, as it turns out, we're in a subject called art and interaction in new media, and we spent the first 4 weeks talking about art, and now we're going to talk a little bit about that second noun in our 3-noun course code. We have 3 nouns, a preposition, a conjunction, and an adjective. So we're talking about art, we're talking about interaction, and we're talking about new media. So there's plenty of content around new media in this course. And so I think it's really important to consider the idea of interaction both in new media and outside new media, and thinking about it in terms of quite specifically art. And so if you've just come into the chat, maybe drop something down about an experience that you might have had with interactive something or other. Maybe is it interactive art? Have you experienced interactive art before? If so, who was the artist? Chuck down some examples, and if we have time at the end of the lecture, we can have a little look at those. In the meantime, I'm assuming that you can all hear me and see me okay. So unless someone puts in the chat otherwise, I will continue. So, interactive art in art theory. Now, one of the things that is infuriating to me about interactive art that I've learned a lot in the time that I have been researching particularly this topic, but also when I talk to people about interactive art exhibitions, is that it's not particularly theorized and theorizable subjects. Or I should say, what I mean by that is it's a very blurry term, like what counts as interactive. And you would think that it shouldn't be as blurry a topic as the word art. Art itself is considered very fluffy, very fuzzy, and not necessarily easily defined. And interactive art, the term interactive often gets misused towards all kinds of things that often tend to mean that if something is new or interesting or engaging, that it is interactive. And hopefully by the end of this lecture, what you take away is some actually concrete sort of ways of thinking about how interactive art works, what counts as interactive, and then also how to judge interaction by degrees of what we might call weak interactive or strong interactive terms. And one of the, there's a bit of a typo there where I've included two overlapping images. But here we have an installation of artworks by a group called the Group Research d'Art Visuel, which was a group of artists in the 1950s and 1960s, actually no, pretty much active just in the 1960s, who were really interested in making art more participatory and getting people out of the typical way of looking at art and into more dynamic, spatial ways of working. And in this image alone, what we have is a bit of a Where's Wally of both interactive and non-interactive artworks, which beg to us the question, what counts in this image as something that could be interactive? Can you see any artworks in this cornucopia of art that could count as interactive? Or does it all count as interactive? And are you struggling to find an example that is in fact not interactive? So I'll clarify that image credit for later on, and I'll push that later. Because what seems to be happening is we're missing one of my slides. So two of the slides have merged together, where once upon a time they were working quite well. What I might do is I can do a quick fix here. I'm just going to do a switch. Oops. No, it hasn't changed it. Okay, we're just going to roll with it. But I'm seeing that some people are typing in the... Cool, so example of interactive art. Bit.fall is used in product launch. Attendees could tweet words or phrases to Twitter. that would then be picked up by live feed and appear as a water droplet spelled words in bitfall. Ah, that's cool. I'm going to pull that up later on. That's a good one. So my missing slide was a really goofy looking illustration by Stephen Jones, and I'll just pull it up in my browser. This is the goofy thing that I was hoping that the slide would have, but basically interactivity requires a conversation. So if we think about being active is, an artwork that makes us active is not sufficient to be considered interactive, right? So in this example here with from Grav, Groupe de Recherche d'Art Visuel, in this instance, we have a range of works that make the viewer active and perhaps solicit people to enjoy the experience together in an active way. So we have these elements that include sort of, you can see a little girl climbing over these strange looking shaped staircases. You can see someone on the left on these, climbing this steep staircase. And the Groupe de Recherche d'Art Visuel, working in the 1960s, was really interested in finding ways to make art objects and make art environments that took us away from typical sort of viewing experiences that they considered passive and would activate the viewer. And so I think the word active is really important here. By trying to make us active, what they've done is they've made us active, but the question is, are we interacting not necessarily with each other as audience members, but are we interacting with the art? And if we're interacting with the art, what that means is that we're sort of having a conversation with the work. And many of you have probably had the experience in which you're having a conversation with someone and then you realize, oh, this isn't actually a conversation. This is someone talking to me and not really listening to what I'm saying. And actually anything that I say isn't at all shaping the kinds of things that they're saying and then shaping the flow of the conversation. Perhaps you've experienced a conversation where you're talking to someone and you feel like they're not giving you anything back. So no matter what you say in the same situation, you're being overly giving in whatever you put into the conversation and not much is coming out, or alternatively too much is coming out at you that you're not really getting an opportunity to shape what's coming out at you because it's not being interpreted or listened. And Stephen Jones, writing on a lot of digital art, particularly Australian digital art, talks about the cybernetics of artworks and about how they require feedback and response, and that they can feed forward in a sort of, they can have feed forwards, they can have feedbacks, they can have positive feedback loops in which they increase in the kind of dramatic cyclical exchange of information, or they might have a negative feedback loop in which they cancel each other out. We might think about a heating thermostat as a sort of negative feedback loop. You set the temperature to 22 degrees and it has a sensor that detects 22 degrees. And if it doesn't get 22 degrees, it heats up more, and the further away from the 22 degrees, the more it adjusts, and then it gets to the 22 degrees and the negative feedback is where it says, cool, stop heating, and then things calm down. We do this in conversation too. So a good conversation is where you're both kind of shaping together, and it's kind of a collaborative event. Now, in this instance of what makes art interactive, we might say that we can enjoy all of these sort of experiences, but in very few of the examples can we actually shape the behavior of the artwork itself, particularly in the examples of the stairs. In the stairs and those sort of step structures, whatever we do, those step structures stay unmoved from our behavior. Maybe they accept a nick or a dent or whatever if we are a bit rough with them. Whereas if we look in the sort of to the right of the center, there's young kid standing on a platform that is tilted. And what happens when that boy stands on that on that platform is that it tilts, and it changes the shape and behavior of that work. And then that work changes the feeling and feeds back to the user, which then tells the user or shifts the gravity in a certain way for the user, who can then feel that, and then they can perform an action which may correct or change that. So in a sense, the artwork has certain kinds of potential, certain kinds of properties in which it is capable of doing certain things, and that those certain things are given back to the user, who then makes a further decision about how to then respond to that thing. And you can imagine a user on that platform might receive that gravity information and that tilt, that spatial shift, and then just enjoy that experience and then leave it at that. Or they may actually decide to rock it even further, and so then they're sort of shaping this. And so they're changing the form, they're changing a number of aspects of the work. They're not changing everything about the work. It has sort of set parameters in which it just tilts, but that tilt is steerable, maneuverable by the user. There's a really interesting comment in the chat from Ryan. I think wall art is harder to define as interactive. The other things encourage the viewer's direct physical participation, whereas the wall art at a guest doesn't. Okay, so we're considering now the idea of participation. What does participation mean? So we've got a few adjacent kind of terms that are worth kind of introducing now. And so with these words, this is where we can get quite a few myths of interactivity, right? So for example, one myth of interactivity is that interactive art is better than or greater than so-called traditional art. And when we say traditional art, we typically mean something like drawing, painting, sculpture, things that, to quote Back to the Future, you use your hands, that's like a baby's toy. Things that involve actual physical handling are sort of seen as Neolithic, whereas interactive art, the interactive, it's probably made with new media, it's made with new 21st century sensibilities. Well, we'll probably learn today that that's not necessarily the case, that interactive art can actually be really dull, boring, and way less interesting than traditional art. One of the other myths is that digital art is more interactive than non-digital art. So we'll have a look at some examples of digital art that is certainly not more interactive than non-digital art, because we've started at a point in which we've at least looked at some non-digital art that is interactive. But then there's the people that sort of view art as always interactive, and that's the whole point of art, is that art is, to sort of use the terminology that Rowan offered us, that there is the view that actually all art requires an audience participation of some degree, and therefore all art is somewhat interactive. So if all art is interactive, why are we talking about it? But then the other view is that, well, actually, I play a lot of video games, and video games have a lot of buttons, and I, get to meander across all different parts of the gaming platform. And so one of the myths that I argue is that the myth is that video games equal interactive art. And I want to dispute that, because actually what interactive art is doing is offering an experience that video games tend not to offer, based on the sort of form that video games encompass. And one piece of evidence around that is that games have always sat adjacent to the arts, and that they may involve the arts at various points, but the aims of a game is often substantially different. So there are these sort of adjacent ideas to interactive art that include, the idea of a video game or any kind of game. I've been playing a lot of Monopoly on my iPad this year, thanks to COVID. I have a lot of aesthetic experience in playing that game, but it's a game, it's not an artwork. There's participatory art, so there's art that requires my participation to exist. An example of that might be kind of any of the following terms would count as participatory art, or certainly relational aesthetics would, which might involve my being invited as an audience member into a performance art experience and to become an agent in a performance art work. So relational aesthetics is this field of art making that is particularly loved by contemporary artists because it takes the position that all art forges social relations, and therefore all art is relational, and that how we should judge art is based on the ways that it forges relationships between people together. And then there's collaborative art. Collaborative art, a good example of that is someone makes a musical instrument and then someone plays the musical instrument and the result is sort of collaborative. But it's not necessarily interactive art because the instrument is an instrument, not an artwork, but the final product might be the artwork. And then another idea is this idea of immersive art. Okay, so, and I think this is one of the best sort of examples that technology doesn't equal interactivity. In fact, technology can be used to create very, extremely sumptuous immersive environments. But if we look at this example with Pippilotti Rist, her Worry Will Vanish Horizon from Hauser and Wirth, what we get is a projection mapped image of these very sort of like tranquil, new agey, natural human videos, and then these beanbags to kind of basically flop down on and just let this artwork, this immersive artwork, just sort of wash over us. But we're in fact invited to be very passive in this experience, to the point of, we're lying down on beanbags and, going through this. But this doesn't actually sort of mean that just watching something is not being involved or participating. For example, a large part of the intention of this work, or of Pippilotti Rist's work, is very adjacent to sort of relaxation, meditation-y types of aesthetics. And so by being a body on the beanbag, we are contributing to the work. It's just that we're contributing to the intention and the audience of the work, but we're not actually shaping the work in itself. And this is really important because how we distinguish between what the artwork is and what the audience is, and what distinctions we create between the context of the work and how someone engages with the work, where the work begins and ends, is a really important ontological question, right? So this is a photograph, this is an artwork by Thomas Struth. What he did was he spent some time taking photos of people who view artworks. And this was taken at the Art Institute of Chicago, where this is an impressionist painting in the center, painted by Caillebotte. And at this time, the impressionists were really interested in going around taking photos and being flaneurs, which was, just being photographic tourists of the cities of Paris, whatever, and painting these images. And in Thomas Struth's photographs, we're looking at how people are using these images. And in this instance, we certainly get a sense that they're sort of passively standing and looking. But at the same time, when you look at the psychology of how someone looks at a painting or a drawing or a sculpture or, these quote unquote traditional arts, or we could just say non-interactive artworks, very complex neurological things are going on, where people are sort of projecting their own psychological emotive weight into things that are built into these pictures and to these objects that then stimulates sort of emotional cycle of neurological behavior that doesn't seem to be present on the outside. So this is where quite a lot of people suggest that we're all, like, all artworks are interactive because they make us active, and they do. But what we can see here is quite clearly that these people are not shaping the artwork. In fact, if we didn't have these people in front of the artwork would continue to be the exact same object. It just may not have anyone there to interpret it the way that these people are interpreting it. But their interpretation does not change how the artwork is as an object. It changes the people, perhaps. But then if we have a look at some of Thomas Struth's other works of people in museums, presumably looking at things, we have some people looking around at the various parts of the Vatican. This is the Vatican Museum in Rome. Of course, these people are very active, and perhaps they might be interactive with each other, but they're not creating the work, or the work is not soliciting them to do something that then goes on to change the work. So the conversations that are not happening between the people and the artwork. The artwork is telling the people something, presumably, if the people are looking and listening. The artworks are sort of broadcasting something, and the people might be interacting with each other in a conversation or broadcasting to each other in a conversation. But whatever the people say to the artwork is not going to shape what the artwork is and does. And this brings us to a really important question of interfaces, because we've had the viewing pleasure of observing a couple of photographs by Thomas Struth among his many sort of museum artwork, sort of ethnographic studies. And we're able to do that because of certain devices that Thomas Struth has employed that have had an enduring importance in how traditional, quote unquote, artworks present an interface that allows the user to engage in the thing in the way that the thing was intended to be engaged with. And this is a work by Jean-Simeon Chardin, and Chardin has this work called Young Student Drawing. And in the 18th century, paintings exhibited these very similar traits to Thomas Struth's photographs, where the user of the painting, so to speak, was allowed to view this work and to feel comfortable viewing this work because of certain compositional strategies, specifically that the people depicted in the painting are absorbed doing something and therefore are unaware of the beholder looking at them. So traditional artworks have, I guess, what you would call these days as an interface. Okay, my apologies, folks. I was told that I got disconnected, so I think I'm back up and running, and hopefully... Anyway, I'll just reiterate my most recent point. Basically, what I was saying is that by having a figure so wholly absorbed in what they're doing, that creates an interface that allows a user of a painting to contemplate and feel free to contemplate what they're doing in front of this work without the work actually caring about them. And we see this in Thomas Struth's photographs. We see people absorbed in the act of looking. And that's what Thomas Struth is playing on. And this view of this interface comes from a philosopher named Diderot. And Diderot was the major critic of the 18th century in Paris, writing his salons. And the critic Michael Fried has made done an amazing translation and analysis of Diderot's salons to flesh out these sort of interfaces. And Diderot would really privilege this kind of absorptive work as, if it was wholly absorbed, it would be this like grand tableau and was worthy of our attention. But an artwork like this was not. This was considered theatrical because it had an interface that was hard to use. Okay, so if we look at the what Diderot was trying to say about this interface, what we find is that he actually didn't like it when people didn't look wholly absorbed in what they were doing. And the clues in which these people weren't wholly absorbed in what they were doing are that we have this figure in the left who is painting the two cupids on the right. Painting one of the cupids actually. The other two are just tagging along and holding up the canvas. And by placing, by having a figure that's painting but doesn't really appear to be looking at the painting. The figure looks like she's looking past the painting. The cupid at the top looks like, the angel at the top looks like they're looking far away. Both of the figures on the right don't particularly look like they're looking at anything or one in particular. No one seems wholly absorbed in any of the tasks that they're doing. Okay, why is this a crime for an artist to have their work do this? Well, Diderot said that because they weren't wholly absorbed in the work, in their task, that they were actually there because they knew that we were there and they were doing this to sort of seduce our attention, and they were on display for us, and that that made it theatrical, and it made it actually inauthentic, and it made it really difficult for us. So it sort of broke the fourth wall, I guess, and it made it difficult for us to actually just have that contemplative engagement with the work. So it sort of felt like, for Diderot, it felt like how we feel like when an ad on YouTube comes up to us, like starts, and it's just shouting at us, and it's asking us questions, and it's directly referring to us. And that's a strategy of advertising that we'll look at in week 8 or 9, I think, one of those two, which is when an image seems like it's harassing us. And so for these early interfaces, that seemed to be the issue. And so artists were charged to create these interfaces in which we were free to experience and enjoy the story without feeling like the artwork was trying to get our attention, and that this was a kind of supreme fiction that an artist has to make something that sort of doesn't care if you engage or not. In fact, it gives you the space to not engage with it, but also gives you the space in an inviting, hospitable way for you to engage the work. Now, why do we care about these 18th century and 19th century works? Well, one thing that's really interesting in the developments of the works was that in about 1863, a generation of artists started developing examples of works that struck the viewer. So they started integrating these, sort of really getting into this idea of the viewer being wholly aware that they're being regarded by the painting. And as the modernization of society came about, it became much more interesting to sort of annoy and play with the viewer. Here we have a rug with an animal that looks like it's sort of roaring at the viewer, while this woman stands in a wholly unabsorbed state. So there's this loss of absorption, this change to the behavior of the beholder. And what they're doing, for better or worse, is this generation of artists is changing the interface of art. Okay? Up to a point where Marcel Duchamp, we've seen what Duchamp did with the urinal and with other works of Dada and the Surrealists. But part of Duchamp's rejection of quote-unquote retinal art, which we might call traditional art, things that look like things, paintings that look like things, paintings that look like people, was this introduction of addressing the viewer, creating a wholly different interface to artworks so that they invited the viewer in very different ways. And this is one of Duchamp's examples of what's called a rotary demisphere, which is, by pressing a button, the viewer starts this hypnotic thing that is powered by this fan belt and motor. And so it's a kinetic sculpture. We see the influx of sort of the button, where a user presses a button and the artwork begins. And it's, similar times as the development of cinema and these kinds of mechanical things, but it came with instructions: press the button and stand 1 meter away. Once things start with instructions, they certainly start a level of, whether it's a weak level of interactivity, it's still a conversation that's starting where a user is pressing a button and the artwork is beginning. So if the user doesn't turn up, the artwork doesn't turn up either. This is one of Duchamp's other strategies, which we wouldn't call interactive, but we might call immersive or participatory. It's a mile of string spun around an exhibition, hostilely forbidding audience members to, quote unquote, passively attend an exhibition of paintings and to view those paintings in that traditional retinal way. And Duchamp has had an immense influence on the development of art. Just as Duchamp was becoming incredibly famous is where we see artists from the Grav, that is, again, the Groupe de Recherche d'Art Visuel, French collaborative, develop this situation where they're trying to develop new interfaces in art. And that's really what we're dealing with when we look at this slide here. We're looking at different interfaces for art, not necessarily interactive interfaces, but still different interfaces that go beyond those absorptive or those struck kind of ideas of looking at art. And really keen on, so you can consider Julio Leparc and the other Grav artists as people kind of researching towards new interfaces of art. Nam June Paik is a famous Fluxus artist who's, his work Magnet TV is a really interesting early, one of the better good examples of electronic interactive art. Not yet digital, but what it is it's a television with a magnet that sits on the television, and at least in its first displays, audience members were invited to pick up the magnet and move the magnet around. And as we can see in this image, the magnet is causing this very pretty looking oscillating form on the TV display. That's an integration of the mechanics of the television and its optics and the magnetic properties within the TV that are being manipulated by the magnet. So the interface here is that the user can pick up this magnet, and then with the magnet becomes this navigation tool to then change the work. Okay, so we started with the button, then we had different gravity interfaces with the Grav examples that were physical, and in these electronic examples, artists are finding a way to give us a control that manipulates the signal flow of the artwork in and of itself. And it's not a game, it's an interactive artwork, I swear. We'll figure out why it's not a game soon enough. Here's that gorgeous illustration I did show you before. So a user of the TV picks up the magnet, the TV is showing something, the user moves the TV around, the magnetic flows send feedback to the TV, which then feeds back the aesthetic experience that appears on the television, which then informs the user of what next to do. Maybe we can, I think it's this one. So skip forward, we now have generations of artists that are really interested in the aesthetic possibilities of interactivity. And what I mean by that is that it's not just necessarily that artists are into interactivity for interactivity's sake, necessarily, but they are in fact interested in what is the aesthetic potential of interactivity. As in, if I made the interaction the, I guess, unit that is aesthetically measured, then what kinds of work come up with that? So it's not necessarily about how clever I am as someone bringing new technology in, but I'm actually soliciting a certain type of conversation between audience member and technology or material or whatever. So this is an example of a work by Raphael Rosendahl. We're going to look at two Raphaels today. This is our first Raphael. He's Canadian-Mexican artist and works a lot in interactive art in an installation setting. We're going to first look at Raphael Rosendahl, and then we'll look at people that are probably closer to the work that we do here in P5 using the kinds of interfaces that we'll be using. But this will give us a sense of how we might aesthetically judge interaction. So this is a work called Pulse Room. It's the user is invited to come and touch these sensors that then register the heartbeat, and then that heartbeat pulses into a light globe, and then that light globe, that rhythm pulses on the first light globe in a grid of artworks. So that grid is then actually, not quite sure what this is doing here. All right, this isn't. So, okay. So the heartbeat is registered, and then that's the heartbeat of the user. And then it appears in the first of a grid, and then the rest of the installation is everyone else's heartbeat of the most recent of the number of light bulbs that they have, and you can see how they all flicker. So it's interesting because it's bringing hearts together. So it has this poetic, metaphorical beauty to it. It also has this shimmery optical experience of just like waves of heartbeats. And this one actually sent me to a medical center shortly after, because my heartbeat was the fastest heartbeat at the MCA in Sydney, and I grew very concerned about that. And then it turned out that it was nothing and that it was all fine after I went to the doctor and got plugged into a whole lot of machines. So, you know, what that tells me is that this work also has profound implications for who we are in terms of the longevity of ourselves and people, but also there are those poetic things that are involved. How do I get out of here? So Raphael Rosendahl, he's, you know, kind of typical for an interactive artist who foregrounds the idea that if someone doesn't turn up to the work, then the work doesn't actually exist. So he tries to set up conditions which foreground that. This is an example of quite a successful one that I think he's done, where he's here used rows of motorized measuring tapes, and they record the time that a person has stood in a part of the room, and they project upwards. And so it seems like an interesting data visualization, but as we watch how people participate and use the work, what we'll start to see is a change of behavior that this develops in the users. I might just skip forward a little bit. All right, so here we go. We're seeing the mechanism where there's a surveillance camera that maps where someone is in the room, and then triggers the tape measure to grow and to keep propelling outside of the motor. And then when it reaches its max, it crashes down. And I really love how, you know, when you see that work, the crashing down is actually really jarring. It's really rough and angry, and I just love how that group of people just like ran out of the room, because, you know, in the end that's just going to keep happening and happening and happening. So it sort of creates a very aesthetic experience that then elicits a response from the viewer. Do you run away? Do you stick around? Do you enjoy the crash? Do you hate the crash? And there's a few other examples of, I'll just close some tabs. There's a few other really great examples of Lozano Hemmer's works that I've linked to here that create new interfaces. So like there's a series of cameras that map where someone is in space, and images of an eye change, like an image sequence or a GIF might, but changes to follow the movements of a person. So I suppose what we've got with Raphael Lozano Hemmer's work is, in a sense, a use of a certain kind of input that the user gives, which is their own image. And when the camera can't see them, the eye closes. So there are sensors. An interactive artwork has sensors, in those instances cameras, or a sort of heart rate monitor. This is a work that uses, so this is a work about, it's a facial recognition artwork, so it uses a camera to detect the user's face, and it compares the user's face against a series of photographs of school-age children that went missing or were kidnapped after a massacre that occurred in Mexico. And what it does is it has this sort of missing persons register, and it sort of scans the user's face, reads the face, and then tells the person which of the missing people they most look like, and the percentage of confidence it has that they are in fact that person. So it's linking strategies of facial recognition to a database of faces, and it's inviting the user to be scanned. It's reading their face, and then it's telling them something about themselves, like, you look most like this person. But at the same time, it's also explaining that, or reinforcing that there are people that are missing, and that we can't find them, and, you know, you're not this person, and we're still searching. So there's a poeticism to works of this kind. And then eventually, if there's a 100% confidence that someone has been found, then, you know, that'll probably be really great for the families of those people. I'll skip this one for a sec, because I do just want to talk about, you know, if we're dealing with heart rate monitors, you're all working in a library of P5 that particularly deals with the kinds of sensors that the computer can take or can read. So it would be great if you could start to jot down some ideas, and even share them in the chat if you can, about different ways that your interactive works might actually sort of be able to take or listen to the user. Is it, you know, we've seen through the camera and through heart rate, and an Arduino is the technology that a lot of interactive artists use outside, like if they're not browser artists, if they're sort of in installations and public spaces, they're often using this technology, which is an Arduino, which can connect to a laptop, and then you connect it to Arduino software and you code, and there are these inputs and outputs. So you can plug things into the Arduino, and then you can type code to say, at this port, receive this kind of information. If you get this kind of information, send information to this output. And so that's where you can start to connect a lot of things that aren't native to computers into a system if you want to create a sort of site-specific object. And I want to briefly talk about Raphael Rosendahl. I want to show you a few of his websites. I'm going to start looking at one of his websites. We've had a look at a few, but I want to sort of first explain what I mean by some artworks, like some games are interactive, but they're not necessarily artworks. And I'm just going to scroll down for one of his works in particular that I think helps really clarify that. And that is this one here, whywashesad.com. So I'll just turn the volume down. If I do nothing, we get all these clouds. But if my cursor touches a cloud, it deletes them. So this is creating an interface that allows me to be involved, but also it tempts me to get rid of all the clouds. But then the clouds keep coming. Now, what is it about this that makes it an artwork and not a game, when it looks a lot like, say, the functionality of Space Invaders, where my space is being invaded and I'm trying to shoot these things out of my picture plane? What is this missing, or what is this doing that's not quite gamified? And we'll keep thinking on that. I'm going to close that for a second, but we'll come back to it. These are a few of Raphael Rosendahl's works. So this one in particular is not at all interactive. It's very digital. It's very good looking and looks a lot like his interactive works, but it just does what it does. This one here looks familiar, like a car racing game. And if I press my cursor, my car accelerates. It accelerates and I'm waiting for something to happen, but nothing's happening. But as soon as I move my cursor to the left and keep my button pressed, it moves to the right. And as soon as I bring it back, it starts to move to the left. If I want to bring it to the center, I can just stop accelerating and then keep accelerating, or I can take my finger off the button and it'll just come to a halt. So it's kind of inviting me to play with it in a sense by giving me an ambiguous interface that gives me space to be a part of it. But at the same time, and it looks to all intents and purposes like many games out there, Mario Kart, Daytona, whatever. But then at the same time, it's fundamentally different from those games in certain particular ways. And I wonder what those ways are. Okay. Yeah, you've all basically got a big part of why these aren't games. Alma's saying that there's no winning or losing. Okay, so there's the stakes are zero. Benedict's saying there's no scoring. You know, you're not compelled to get a higher score, which then drives a certain kind of behavior. And nothing that you do from Rowan, nothing that you do impacts the state of the work for more than a few seconds. So that gives me an immense freedom. I don't get performance anxiety, and it doesn't matter if I play against the intentions of the user, either nothing of the developer, either nothing will happen or something interesting will happen. In the case of Why Is He Sad, it makes me ask the question, why am I trying to get rid of the clouds at all? Why don't I just take my cursor out of the browser window and just allow the clouds to be? So I get to ask these sort of questions around, you know, what am I trying to achieve here? Why am I trying to achieve it? Whereas if we think about a game usually does have winners or losers. It has a scoreboard because the maker of the game is compelling you to behave in a certain way that's goal-oriented. In these artworks, there's no goal, there's no winning, there's no losing. And so that creates a more open exploration of the work and the kinds of interpretation or interpretive potentials that the work can actually have. This example here, nothing that I do is going to influence this work, but it's not going to stop me from enjoying the work. It's just to say that this is probably not a great example of interactive work. So, you know, have a think about also what is being input into this example. Like what information am I putting in here? You know, I've probably given this one away, but let's take another artwork here. What does this program need to listen to from me? What kinds of information does it need to pay attention to for me? And then, what is it giving back to me? And by answering those questions, we get a sense of how to think about what are the determinants of an interactive artwork, and how can we make aesthetic experiences that aren't necessarily gamified, but actually open for the user, but that give us a sense of kind of aesthetic intention. So there's some examples here in these links. And just by way of starting to wrap up, there's a few ways to start to make an interactive artwork. One is to start with a quick drawing of the interface. You know, what is the thing going to look like? How are you going to invite the user to use the work and not make the user run away? Because there are interactive artworks, just like there are non-interactive artworks, that put us off, that are bossy or something, or are preachy, or just kind of annoying. So what kind of interface could an interactive artwork have? And you can start with the technology. What technologies and what techniques are available? If we look at Raphael Rosendahl, the browser artist, he works a lot with Flash. He's confined to the window of the browser. We look at someone like Raphael Rosendahl, he's got a much more open slather by using an Arduino, where he can input lots of different sensory technologies and output lots of different media displays. But we do see that he looks at certain patterns of ways of making things. For example, he does a lot of heart rate monitoring. He does a lot of light globe stuff. He does a lot of surveillance-oriented stuff. He does a lot with searchlights, and he does a lot with various kinds of technologies. So you can start with the kinds of functions that you already know from the P5 library. What are things that do what? Is it mouse X? Is it mouse Y? Is it buttons? Is there anything else in the P5 library that you can get across in terms of input? What kinds of things can P5 connect to in terms of the hardware of computing, of computers? Or you can start with the user experience. What do you want them to feel? Okay, so with this, Raphael Rosendahl, this is taken from a video, Like Knows Like, that's linked at the end and also linked here. Every day he starts his day by going for a swim and then going to the library and sketching out a few different interface ideas that can then become potential artworks that he'll start talking to his coders to get these to turn into something. And then with the user experience, what do you want them to feel? And I kind of want to just end on this work here. This is an exhibition that Raphael Rosendahl had, where he used surveillance cameras to monitor who was in the gallery space, and if they moved, then the sound of the mosquito would play on loudspeakers throughout the gallery space. And we know that the sound of a mosquito is a very annoying thing. So if we start this aesthetic experience with Raphael Rosendahl wants us to feel annoyed, this is a really great way of going about it. So if the people are moving, the mosquito buzzes, and if the people stay still, the mosquito stops buzzing. And it's a sort of spatial experience of this website that he has here, the Nosquito. And we know he didn't start with sketching an interface because there's nothing to see here. But I hope you can hear that. But it's a spatial experience of this website where as I move my cursor, however much I move my, like, as long as the cursor is moving, this is feeding back to me a very annoying sound that is making me feel a certain way. So there's a couple of videos on Raphael Rosendahl that are worth checking out. He's a really interesting artist for the browser, so don't hesitate to have a look at that. I am just going to jump back in the chat and see some of the comments while we're here. Benedict, your comment, video games are definitely interactive, so the question there is whether or not they are art. Great question. And so some video games might count as art, some of them might count as design, and some of them might count as cheap entertainment. Doesn't mean we like them any less. In fact, Raphael Rosendahl has this really ambiguous game that I wanted to show you, but it needs 2 players, and you can download it on as an app. It's called Finger Battle, and you can play it with your friends, and I'd love to know what you think in terms of whether it's art or a game, or if it's both, and can it be both. Yeah, so Sarah's making this interesting point around how art sits within games. So for example, graphics are considered art. If you replace textures with something less artistic, would it ruin the point of the game? So when we talk about art, in this instance, I guess we're talking about graphical rendering. And so there are artistic things that you can do with graphical rendering, sometimes nostalgic by going back to old forms of graphics, but and sometimes really sophisticated. And sometimes the intention there is to kind of direct that sort of point scoring seduction to get people interested in looking at the hyper-realism of the game, and to drive those points up and drive the drama of the winning and the losing. Yeah, but I love this idea of more art and more game that you guys are jumping on too. Ben, yes, there is a lot of debate about what isn't interactive art. So not clear about what left the qualities, to be honest. So I guess the takeaway from this is, if we think about interactivity as a conversation, and if we think about there being a signal flow between the user and the artwork and the sort of medium itself, or the artwork itself, we want to think about interactive art as something that is a combination of the user and the artwork making something together. So a feedback of the artist putting in some parameters that invite the user to use, and then the outcome of that is co-created between the program and or between the interface and the audience, in a way that's tangible and not just in the audience's own mind. Fantastic. All right, Benedict, I'm loving that you're annoying that artwork. Cool. Well, so that's my spiel on interactive artworks. Let me know how you get on. Look forward to hearing and seeing examples of things for the next assignment. I'm going to let you all go now because it's a little bit after 4, and I think you've had to deal with quite a bit.